The neon sign above Ellie's diner flickered weakly against the cold, dark highway, casting a soft, red glow that barely touched the edges of the empty parking lot. It was a quiet, familiar place, a simple roadside stop off Route 66 in a small town in Illinois where the coffee was always hot, the pies came fresh from the oven, and the old wooden floors creaked underfoot like they had stories of their own. Nothing fancy, nothing remarkable. But to those who knew it, Ellie's diner had a kind of magic that no one could quite explain. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where a tired trucker could rest his bones, or a lonely soul could forget the weight of the world, just for a little while. Ellie Thompson, 46, had been working there for nearly 15 years. The faded blue apron she wore had become as much a part of her as her own skin. The clink of plates, the hum of the kitchen, and the soft murmur of old country songs playing on the jukebox in the corner had long become the soundtrack to her life. It was just past midnight now, and the dinner rush had come and gone. A couple of truckers sipped on their coffee, the only sound in the room the slow shuffle of their boots and the occasional clink of a spoon against a mug. Ellie wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter, her eyes lingering on the man sitting alone at the far booth. He had been coming in for weeks now, an older man with worn clothes and a face that carried the weight of too many years. And tonight, like every other night, he hesitated before crossing the threshold into the diner. But tonight, something felt different. As the door creaked open, a gust of chilly air swept through the diner, carrying with it the scent of the cold night and the lingering promise of something unspoken. The bell above the door jingled softly, almost like a weary sigh. Ellie glanced up, her gaze immediately falling on the man standing at the entrance. His coat hung loosely on his thin frame, its edges frayed and worn as though it had seen years of hard use. His boots, scuffed and battered, were on the verge of falling apart, and his hands rough and calloused shook slightly as he counted the crumpled bills in his palm. He'd been here before, many times, but always just long enough to remind the world he still existed, before turning away. Tonight, though, he stood in the doorway, his eyes flickering toward the warmth inside, a battle waging silently behind them. Ellie had seen it in him before: hesitation, discomfort. He wasn't used to asking for help, not in a place like this. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Something that told her this time he wasn't just passing through. Ellie stood from behind the counter and walked toward him, her boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. "You coming in, or just standing there freezing?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes searching. He paused for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze darting between the empty booth and the truckers at the counter, as if weighing the choice of stepping inside against the shame that might follow. Without waiting for him to decide, Ellie grabbed a menu from the counter, walked past him, and placed it on the table closest to the window. "Sit," she said gently, her voice soft but firm. He looked at her for a moment, eyes filled with uncertainty, then finally shuffled inside, lowering himself into the booth with a heaviness in his bones that spoke of years of wear and tear. Ellie watched the old man settle into the booth, his joints creaking like the worn-out furniture around him. He hesitated for a moment, his gnarled hands hovering over the menu, tracing the prices with a careful finger. It was like watching someone try to figure out if they could afford a slice of cake after a long diet. Ellie could see the silent calculation in his eyes: soup or a sandwich, a cup of chili, or something heartier. It wasn't hard to read he was thinking, what can I afford, and what's going to keep me from feeling hungry until tomorrow? Ellie leaned against the counter, arms crossed, pretending to look busy while she observed him. The truckers were busy grumbling about fuel prices, a tired old song playing on the jukebox in the corner, and the diner's fluorescent lights flickered every now and then like they were about to call it a night, too. Finally, the man broke the silence with a gravelly voice like a rusted hinge. "I'll just take the soup," he mumbled. "Potato, if you've got it." Ellie raised an eyebrow and shook her head, crossing her arms in that way that only someone who's worked in a diner for too long could. "Soup's fine, sure, but the sandwich too." It's not like I'm running a charity here. Kitchen's slow tonight. She flashed him a playful grin, her voice carrying a little more mischief than she meant. The man blinked, looking at her like she'd just told him the secret to the universe. Before he could protest, Ellie was already calling to Lou in the kitchen, her voice warm and confident. "Hey, Lou. Potato soup and a turkey sandwich extra mustard." She gave Lou a wink. He didn't smile, he never did, but his grunt of acknowledgement was enough to tell her he'd be on it. Ellie turned back to the man, who was still looking at her with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I'm not going to let that soup go to waste," she added with a wink of her own, easing the tension in the air. "Now eat up." As Ellie moved behind the counter, pretending to wipe an already clean glass, she watched him carefully. The old man, Walter, sat with his hands folded on the table, his fingers fidgeting like they were trying to figure out how to hold on to something invisible. He stared at his soup for a while, like he was waiting for it to magically disappear. The way he lifted the spoon, then hesitated, then set it down again like the soup might bite back, had Ellie wondering what kind of war the man had fought in. But she didn't ask. That was the thing about people who've seen too much, they didn't want to talk about it, and Ellie knew better than to push. "Used to drive a truck, you know," Walter said suddenly, his voice low but steady as he carefully picked up the spoon again, taking a slow sip. His eyes flicked out the window as though the past was sitting just outside, waiting to make an entrance. "Long hauls. East Coast to Texas, sometimes further." Ellie raised an eyebrow, putting the dishcloth down with a small clink. She had a feeling there was more to this man than just old highway miles. "Truck driver?" she asked, leaning against the counter, already half knowing the answer. Walter didn't look up, but there was a certain weight in his voice that said he wasn't just a truck driver. No, he was something more, a man who carried a history that had aged him before his time. "Not always," he muttered, his voice growing quieter. "Drove rigs after the war." The war, of course. The words hung in the air like smoke from a long-forgotten campfire. Ellie didn't press. She'd been around long enough to know that some questions were better left unasked. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression softening. "Why'd you stop driving?" she asked casually, like it was no big deal. But the question, in truth, was far heavier than it sounded. Walter paused, and when he spoke again, his words were wrapped in a bitter smile. "The body gives out before the will does." Ellie chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Ain't that the truth?" she said, her voice carrying a note of understanding. "We all slow down eventually." And just like that, the conversation shifted. There were no more heavy questions, just two people sitting in a diner, sharing a quiet moment between sips of soup. But Ellie couldn't help but feel that something bigger than just a meal was unfolding. Walter took another slow bite, savoring the turkey sandwich like it was the last decent meal he'd had in years. Ellie watched him from behind the counter, pretending to busy herself with another glass, but her eyes kept darting back to the booth where he sat. There was something almost comical about the way he took his time with every mouthful, chewing as if each bite had its own complex backstory. Like the man wasn't just eating, but reliving an entire chapter of his life with each chew. It made Ellie smile, though she knew better than to say anything. The diner was quiet now, save for the occasional clink of silverware and the soft hum of the jukebox playing an old Johnny Cash tune. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside, the air felt warmer, almost like time itself had slowed down to match the rhythm of Walter's chewing. "Used to drive all over," he said again, his voice almost nostalgic. "Back when I had legs that didn't ache like an old car engine." He looked at Ellie, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Texas, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Didn't matter where, long as the rig was running." His eyes darkened slightly, though, as the memory seemed to slip away into the distance. "I think the road's the only thing that ever truly understood me." Ellie nodded, trying to suppress the laugh that was threatening to slip out. "Sounds like you miss it," she said, her voice teasing but kind. Walter let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Miss the road?" "Nah, I miss being somebody." He didn't say it loud, but Ellie caught the weight in his voice, the regret wrapped up in the words. She felt it, too, that deep, aching kind of loss that didn't need explaining. Instead of pushing further, Ellie leaned back against the counter, folding her arms with a grin. "Well, you're somebody now, Walter. Just need to find a way to enjoy the ride a little more." Walter glanced up at her then, his expression softening, and for the first time since he sat down, he seemed to relax just a bit. "Maybe you're right," he muttered, finishing the last of his sandwich. Walter sat back in the booth, the empty bowl of soup and the half-eaten sandwich now just memories on the chipped ceramic plate. He glanced at the crumpled bills in his hand, hesitation flickering across his face. It was clear he wasn't used to being on the receiving end of kindness, and he didn't quite know what to do with the feeling. Ellie could see the battle inside him, the pride fighting against his stomach, which clearly still wanted that sandwich. She leaned over the counter, catching his eye with a smile that was a little too knowing. "How much do I owe you?" Walter asked, his voice low, like he was trying to make up for something he hadn't quite figured out yet. Ellie shook her head, waving him off like he was a stubborn customer who just wouldn't take no for an answer. "Told you, Walter, it's on the house," she said, her tone casual but firm. She wasn't about to let him argue with her. The diner had enough leftover turkey sandwiches to last a week, and if one of those sandwiches was going to make someone's night a little brighter, she wasn't going to miss the chance. Walter's brow furrowed. "I don't take charity," he muttered, his hand tightening around the crumpled bills as though holding onto them could somehow restore his dignity. Ellie rolled her eyes, leaning on the counter with a half-smile. "It's not charity, it's a meal. You've been eating my sandwiches for years now, Walter. You think I'm going to start charging you for good company?" Walter's cheeks flushed slightly, and for a moment, Ellie thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, embarrassment, maybe, or gratitude, or a strange mix of both. But before he could argue further, Ellie just shrugged and went back to wiping down a perfectly clean glass. "Just eat, it's already made, so no sense in letting good food go to waste." He let out a soft, dry chuckle. "You're a stubborn one," he said, finally relenting and letting the bills fall back into his pocket. But Ellie didn't need to hear anything else. She knew the look on his face, acceptance wrapped in a quiet gratitude. The following morning felt like any other, a steady hum of routine. Ellie opened up the diner just before dawn, flipping chairs down with a practiced hand, the sound of metal scraping against wood filling the quiet air. She set up the syrup dispensers, made sure the coffee was brewed strong enough to keep the truckers awake, and wiped down the counter for the 5th time in 20 minutes. It was a slow start, but she was used to that. Life at the diner was all about waiting for the action to pick up. Around noon, the lunch rush hit like a freight train, plates clattered, conversations blended together, and the usual banter about who had the worst hangover or what truck stop served the best fried chicken filled the air. Ellie was right in the middle of refilling a customer's coffee when it happened. It started as a faint vibration in the floor, so soft at first she almost thought it was the jukebox kicking in. But then it grew, the hum of engines vibrating up through her boots, making the salt shakers rattle and the coffee cups tremble on their saucers. The sound grew louder, closer. No, it wasn't just one truck. Ellie turned to the window, and her eyes widened. A convoy of military trucks rolled into the parking lot like something out of a movie. Big, serious-looking vehicles with government plates and dark windows that seemed to swallow the daylight. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She'd seen military convoys before, but not in a place like this, certainly not at her diner. The bell above the door jingled, and Ellie froze. The man who stepped inside was different from the usual crowd of truckers. He had the posture of someone who wasn't used to waiting in line for a cup of coffee. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ellie, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "This was no ordinary customer, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight she couldn't quite place. Ellie wiped her hands on her apron, trying to look casual. "That's me," she said, her throat suddenly dry. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as the officer's words hit her like a ton of bricks. She wiped her hands on her apron one more time, suddenly aware of how nervous her palms felt. "Walter Gaines?" she repeated, her voice sounding a little more surprised than she intended. She glanced around the diner, where the truckers had gone unusually silent, their mugs of coffee now forgotten. Even the old jukebox, which normally hummed with life, seemed to grow quieter. All eyes were on her, waiting for her to say something, anything. The officer didn't say anything at first, his eyes studying her closely, like he was waiting for her to put the pieces together. "You fed him yesterday," he finally said, his voice calm but firm, like this was no small thing. "You gave him a meal." Ellie blinked. She felt like she had missed something important. "Yeah," she said slowly, taking a step back from the counter. "I gave him a turkey sandwich, a bowl of soup. Nothing special." Her voice carried a touch of humor, though her insides were twisting in confusion. The way the officer was looking at her made her feel like she was missing the punch line to a joke that she wasn't in on. The officer's eyes softened just a bit. "It was more than just a meal, Miss Thompson," he said quietly, his gaze flicking over to Walter's now empty booth. "Walter Gaines isn't just any man. He's a decorated war hero. Special Forces, Vietnam." Ellie froze. For a second, the room seemed to shrink around her. The old man she had just given a sandwich to was a war hero, Special Forces even. That's hard to believe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't look like one of those people you see on TV." The officer gave a slight nod. "No, he wouldn't. He never talked about it. But he's a man who's seen things that most people couldn't even imagine. He was the only survivor of his unit during a classified operation back in '71. Ellie's eyes widened, her mind racing. The quiet, tired man with his worn-out boots and shaky hands had been through something she couldn't even fathom. She swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that the sandwich she'd served the night before might have been a lifeline in more ways than one. Ellie stood there, her mind swirling with the officer's words, the weight of them pressing down on her like a thick fog. Walter Gaines, a decorated war hero, how could she have known? He hadn't looked like a hero. He looked like the kind of man who sat at the counter every night, nursing his coffee and talking to no one. He looked like someone who had spent too many years hiding in plain sight, not wanting to be remembered. But now, standing there in the middle of her diner, Ellie realized something. People weren't always what they seemed. The story they wore on their faces wasn't always the whole truth. As the officer spoke about Walter's service, Ellie felt a strange sense of guilt twist in her chest. She'd just fed him a meal, but to Walter, that might have been more than just a free sandwich. It might have been a reminder that there were still people who cared, who saw him for more than the weathered man he had become. In that moment, Ellie understood something important, that sometimes small acts of kindness didn't just fill an empty stomach. They could fill a much deeper void, one that no one else could see. She took a breath and straightened up, the lesson slowly sinking in. Life wasn't about grand gestures or flashy moments. It was about the small, everyday things. It was about noticing someone, about offering something simple and genuine, even when you had no idea what they might be carrying on their shoulders. Walter hadn't asked for her help, hadn't even hinted that he needed it. But in giving him that meal, Ellie had done something more than just feed him. She had reminded him that he mattered. "Is he okay?" Ellie asked quietly, her voice soft with the kind of concern she hadn't expected to feel. The officer gave her a small, understanding nod. "He is now. He made a call, Miss Thompson. After he left here last night, he decided to come back to the world." Ellie nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Sometimes all it takes is a little kindness to show someone that it's worth coming back. Ellie felt the weight of the officer's words still lingering in the air, his quiet confirmation of Walter's past settling in her bones. She watched the convoy pull away through the diner's front window, the sound of the engines fading into the distance, leaving behind only the hum of the jukebox and the clink of silverware. The diner was once again quiet, the usual rhythm of the day returning, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted just a little. That small act of kindness, just giving Walter that sandwich, had somehow set off a chain of events that neither of them had seen coming. It was then that Ellie realized something simple but profound. You never really know the impact you're making in someone's life until long after the moment has passed. Walter had walked into her diner hungry and tired, and she had simply fed him no fanfare, no questions asked. Yet here she was, standing at the counter, knowing that because of that one small gesture, Walter had made the hardest decision of his life. He had chosen to stop running, to step back into the world he'd long avoided. Ellie picked up a cup and filled it with fresh coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air. She looked out at the empty parking lot where the military trucks had once stood and thought about Walter, about his daughter, about the second chances people never seemed to think they deserved. But maybe that was the lesson. That kindness was never too small to matter, and sometimes it was the smallest moments that made the biggest difference. She sighed, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. Life was messy and unpredictable, but there was always a chance to change things, to make things right. It was a lesson Ellie had learned from Walter, of all people. As the bell above the door jingled and a new customer walked in, she smiled. Maybe, just maybe, today would be another day to make a difference one meal at a time.